Okay, well, welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon on civil discourse. And what I want to do is just start by talking a little bit about the struggle and why we're kind of working in this space. But let me start. I'm going to throw a poll up here, and while I'm yakking at you, if you wouldn't mind taking this really brief two-question poll that will just sort of help orient our speakers today to give us a little bit more information about you. And so if you would just fill this two-question survey out real quick while we're again, while I'm doing a few introductions, that'd be great. The first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about the people that are here on our end. So David Martino and Gabrielle Martin and myself, Jeff Hausman, obviously from Arupe Virtual. So the three of us will be doing the Q&A portion of the presentation and so on. And when you're participating in this, you'll notice obviously that your cameras are off and your microphones are off, all of that sort of thing. But what we're going to do is do presenting. Okay, the chat is open, and you should be able to see everybody's chat. So feel free to chat away over there. Okay, but if you have any formal questions, because there will be a Q&A portion to this at the end. If you have a question you want to ask, use the Q&A so we can get you in the queue and we're not trying to go through the chat trying to find everybody. Okay, so that's a really important button. So to use the Q&A button. All right, and so before I introduce our two speakers, though, I want to just share a tiny bit. About productive struggle, right? Because what we're working on at AVLI, right, is this um, is we, I guess the thing is we all know at this point that there's an easy pathway to answers, right? To just if you want answers, they're not hard to come by these days, right? But that's not learning. Okay. And so part of what we're trying to do, I think, is what I think all of our interests should be is to help students kind of in recognizing the need for struggle in order to learn, right? And learning is really the most fundamental component of being a human, right? And so without struggle, you're really downplaying your humanity in many ways, right? And so in that instance, what we really are talking about here is how do we go about doing that, right? How do we go about creating the conditions for students to struggle, okay? And how do we convince students that the struggle is worth it? Right? And so what we're trying to do here in many ways is to provide a vision for a hope-filled future, right? That students are invited into, right? And so when they're in that struggle, when they're invited in and they have the agency to recognize the value in the struggle, right? They want to persevere, right? And so part of what we're trying to do is to create those conditions, okay? Um, so we know technology can help, right, in some of those areas, but we also know that it oftentimes doesn't, right? And so one area where we know that technology sometimes works against us is in its capacity to isolate us from perspective, right? And for those of you who know Pedro Arrupe, obviously Arrupe is important to us, right? He was an advocate for encounter, right? And I think mostly because he recognized that there's no way around it, right? If you're living, right, there's no way around bumping into each other, right? And so, but what's happened recently is technology has made it easier not to bump into each other, right? While also feeling as though you're still connected, right? And so the interesting thing then is what people are connected to are things like confirmation bias, right? Rage, right? Those types of things, right? And when you think about confirmation bias, right, that's not struggle, right? When you think about rage, that's not struggle, right? And so part of what we really need to do is just to be in relationship with, which means conversation. And sometimes that's not easy, right? The easy conversations aren't struggle. And so, luckily, we have people working on this concept of civil discourse, right? Productive conversation, right? Difficult conversation, right? And people like Sarah and John, right? And so, what I'm going to do is just turn this over to them. As you can see in your screen, Sphere is working in this space and they do a great job in this space. Okay. So, Sarah Lane is an educational engagement specialist with Sphere, and John Snode is one of their senior managers. Okay. And so, what I'm going to do really quickly, just to make sure, I want to make sure that Sarah and John get to see who we have here today. So teachers, counselors, administrators, okay, you get a sense of what we're dealing with here. Okay, does that work for you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, all
Perfect.
right. So I'm going to stop sharing that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and John. So thank you again for being here.
Hi, everybody. Sarah, I'll let you go ahead and get us started. I'll pull up the PowerPoint and we'll get the screen shared.
Yeah, so nice to be here with everyone. Thank you for joining us. Uh, Very briefly, you probably read the intro about Sphere and saw that in the communications. But my name is Sarah Lane, and I am originally from Ohio, but was a classroom teacher and then was an instructional facilitator for a while outside of Seattle, currently coming from Virginia. But I am actually a Sphere alum of programming, as well as having brought Sphere to my school district to work on this critical work that Jeff led us into so well in describing. John?
Great to be here, everybody. Thanks, Sarah. My name is John Snowden, and again, a senior manager at Sphere Education Initiatives. My background is 34 years as a public high school social studies teacher, all but one of those years in the state of Ohio. I live in Florida now and taught for a year in retirement here before joining the team a few years ago. So really happy to be here. I also was a high school football coach. So for those of you that wear other hats, we get the pull that often happens to you during your day. But we're just here to help and see if we can give you some ideas and strategies to help students navigate challenging conversations. Briefly, we work in the 5 through 12 space. However, there is some overlap with middle level elementary, third and fourth grade teachers. But the idea here is to create resources and make them available at no cost. So when you have more opportunities to dive into our website, you'll see a deep collection of content that is growing weekly. And the idea behind all of that is we should be able to have conversations about challenging topics that fit within our curriculum. So it's interdisciplinary, living in the social studies space, ELA. We're diving into STEM as well, just a little bit now, and we're going to continue to build those out with our most recent content releases centered on America's 250th, but those are interdisciplinary as well. Our overarching goal is to help lower the temperature, to bring people back to the table, sit down, be able to have civil conversations that are anchored in fact and reason and willing to entertain other ideas, whether they agree with them or not. That's just a little bit about Sphere. We're about 6, 7 years old now, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And Sarah and I and all of our colleagues are somewhat spread out throughout the country, but we love doing this work and we're so happy to be here. I'm going to launch us right into a section that we call the impact of polarization. Here, we'd just like to give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the research that's been done in the last 2 to 3 years on polarization and how it's impacting us in schools. So this is our first question, and we're not able to actually see the chat, so we'll work through this relatively quickly. But the Rand Corporation did a study all throughout 2023 and compiled and released the results in early 2024, literally about 2 years ago this coming March. The poll was asking educators in general, have you been limiting discussions on topics that might be political or of a social nature on your own? So that's to say, you're not being told that you can't bring up a conversation or drop a subject and prepare your students to have a conversation about it, whether it relates to your curriculum or not. You're simply choosing not to for a variety of reasons. And we have the results show that it's about 2/3 that are saying, yeah, I self censor for lots of different reasons. We hear one of the number one reasons is Uh, Concern for outside pressures and stakeholders who might think that teachers are leading students down a particular path, aka indoctrinating students. This is of concern, is that we might be missing on opportunities to help our students navigate topics and help them self-discover their points of view and why they might feel the way that they do. The second piece here, this is an anchoring piece of research that's very important for us. It was used heavily to start raising the funds, as we are a nonprofit. Stanford has been studying polarization now since the early 1980s. And in the early 1980s, the average age that polarization was organically appearing, so in other words, individuals developing their political leans of their own accord and on their own time, and not because of outside pressures, was roughly college age or entering the world of work out of high school. In 2019, they upped the study again, and in 2022 reaffirmed it, that the average age that students are now arriving in your classrooms polarized is about fifth grade. We've had teachers who teach third and fourth grade who are like, yeah, no, we're seeing it too. They're coming in, they're parroting what they hear at home, what they see on their social media. So it's a very, very different world than from the world, for example, that I grew up in many, many moons ago. And this research is available for you, and it will be in the slide deck. We'll be sure to make sure that link is available. We actually have a resource document coming your way at the end here. The next item here is we work with an organization called More in Common, and they study division. They study it worldwide, but they come out with so many really interesting studies on what's going on in our country with the way people see events, issues, uh, historical topics through their political identity lens. And what it's showing us is that there's a gap in the way that we see one another. So in this case, on this particular slide, this was a study they did called Diffusing the History Wars. If you read through these various statements, what you'll see here on this slide is that in red are Republicans or conservatives' estimates of how those on the left view this statement. And so 45%, for example, of Republicans is all that believes that Democrats or progressives value that. When in reality, if you scroll across there, you'll see it was 92% of those on the left who agreed with that statement. I won't insult your intelligence and read through all of these, but you can kind of see that there is roughly a 40 to often 50% point gap between the way those on the right and those on the left see one another. And of course, the independents tend to hug that center line in this case. So that's what More in Common is saying. This is a perception gap. We seem to think that we don't think at all alike, and we should explore why that is. The next slide flips the narrative slightly, a different set of statements, but now what you're seeing here is in blue are Democrats' estimates of what they think those on the right value. And in reality, on the right is what those poll results showed that conservatives actually believe. So at the very top, particularly, you'll notice, again, about a 50-point gap in perception. So it begs the question, why don't we know this? Why do we seem to almost fall into a situation where we think no one thinks the way we do except our friends who are fellow conservatives or progressives? But this is what's coming into our classroom, because students are coming in wired uniquely to be polarized, even if they don't quite understand what they're polarized about. We work with Dr. Eric Smith. He is a professor of rhetoric. He's an expert on polarization and how to navigate that. And when he speaks to educators, often at our events, we hold a big summer event we'll talk about at the end called Sphere Summit. He talks about the 4 Ds that just tear down conversations. And you can read those there, that degrade, we demonize, we dismiss, we discredit. And what we often ask educators, particularly when we have the opportunity to be in person, is we want you to think about this in 2 ways. One is, have you ever felt like this was being done to you? You've been the recipient of someone who might be even mentally, quietly shutting down the conversation because they totally disagree with you, to the point where they might be dismissive of you and hurry to get out of the conversation, and then maybe even actively discredit you. And now that we have all of us can hide behind our screens with all kinds of different identities, it's a more friendly place for that kind of, I would call it dismissive behavior. That now people are doing this all across social media platforms. But the flip side of that is to think about, are you a practitioner? As human beings, you find yourself also doing this to others that you may vehemently disagree with. And so recognizing that we can't have a conversation if we're doing this to one another might be a step in the right direction if we each or all can recognize that. And those might be conversations you have with your students. So we always ask, how can we change the tide as educators? And there are a few points here that I'll breeze through relatively quickly, but important to think about each one. One is for ourselves to get out of our own silos. And oftentimes in our schools, in our environments, we definitely around people who are like-minded in many cases. So as educators, it's great for us to get out of our own bubbles and silos and listen to what's going on in the outside world. If this for you is listening to the different opinion hosts in the evening on television, that might be the way that you do that, or listening to conservative podcasts if you're more of a liberal progressive, or vice versa. But listening to what other people think and not approaching it from the standpoint of you're wrong, you're a horrible person, you're crazy, but to say, I wonder why people think that way because I don't. Number two is consider that we're all biased, and that can enter conversations, and that can be a dangerous place for us to laying out our points of view in a classroom where we might be influencing students who want to please us or who also just want to disagree with us, but then not shaping their own points of view. Avoiding the false binary is that many of the issues that come up in today's society that impact us in the classroom are not simply a yes, no, a black or white, or red or blue response, that positions are nuanced, and that's okay. We should discover what those are and why people think the way they do. And finally, it doesn't have to be about politics. We could go on for a couple more hours on lots more research that we have on this, but it would feel heavy all politics, and we don't want to leave you with that. But we thought it was good to give you a quick picture of that. So in concluding this section is a couple of the educators that are in our network. These two gentlemen have met each other at a number of events, not the least of which is our Sphere Summit in the summer. The gentleman on the left is Julian Braxton. He is a history teacher and the head of DEI at the Windsor School in downtown Boston, Massachusetts. As Julian describes the Windsor School, it's a very progressive school, and the parents are more progressive than their daughters are. It's an all-girls school. And the other gentleman is Brad Faulhaber, and he is a social studies teacher in eastern Montana, the town of Sidney, Montana. The two of them met and realized that their students live in real silos. So Brad's students live in a very red conservative part of the country. Montana is a very red state, and eastern Montana is, as he says, as red can be. So they decided that they would try to find a way to have their students connect. So they do a monthly Zoom meeting with their students. They make it work with time zones, and they choose a topic, and it's structured. It's a structured discussion. So they front load their students with research, court cases, court decisions, legislation, whatever it might take to give them the background to have the conversation. The first one they did was the Second Amendment of all things to choose. Julian's story is fascinating when he talks about his young lady students who were just blown away that students in Montana not only own one or two guns, but have garage cabinets full of 25 to 50 guns, that hunting is just a regular way of life. Whereas the students in Boston didn't understand why they needed any, and certainly why they needed so many, or the types that they needed. Brad's students, conversely, couldn't understand how the students in Boston could not understand that they have a whole different way of life, that hunting and sharing their rifles with their neighbor to go hunting together is a normal way of life, and that gun culture is a normal culture there. So they're trying to bring them together to realize that not everybody's the same. People think differently. And we actually had the chance to zoom in on the election night back in November. Sarah and I did, to listen. They brought their students back to class to go over it, watch the results as they were coming in. It was a fascinating conversation. So these are some neat things that, as you consider your abilities within your space, what you might be able to do. All right, Sarah, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah, so now that we have a bit of a foundation for some research pieces and kind of turning it over now to what we can do as educators and working in this space. So first wanted to start with just a couple pieces on defining civil discourse and context. So that way for the rest of the time when we're sharing lots of strategies and resources, you know exactly with what lens we're doing that through. So the definition that we've used and adopted is from the National Institute for Civil Discourse from at the University of Arizona. And I can let you all read that on your own, but really want to highlight the ending piece there that says that seeks to advance the public interest. And really, even thinking about the example of Julian and Brad that John shared, how is that having these conversations can help advance the public interest and better civic culture? That's our lens in that. And we believe that those discussions and that skill set is built even in the content and day to day in the classroom. So when we're defining it a little bit more, there's a lot of words out there like discourse, debate, dialogue. So as part of our Principles of Civil Discourse primer, which is kind of a go-to guide, we have what civil discourse is and isn't. And just a couple bullet points on both, although some are very self-explanatory, especially for educators. So some like to use these definitions with students, like things like active listening. But one to point out on what civil discourse is the bottom bullet point, that it's based on the responsibility of a participant to engage in good faith, to stay goal-oriented and build mutual understanding. And that piece, especially because that mutual understanding piece, it's, hey, we're having this conversation to lead to understanding one another's viewpoints. That might not change our viewpoints. It might, but the point is our goal is to understand one another's beliefs in that space and why and how. And what it's not, we have a few there, of course, not using stereotypes, name calling, and so on. But it's also not just being polite, which stands out to me. We do want to still assert our viewpoints in the space and encourage students to do so. So, a couple getting started foundational pieces, and our colleague Coleman Britt is here providing some links in the chat as we go for things that are being mentioned. And at the end, we'll share this all as kind of a collection in one PDF for you to take away with resources. But as far as kind of getting started here, establishing healthy classroom norms is something we encourage to have norms for discourse that are in addition to your classroom rules. So having a specific set to refer to when engaging in these activities. So we encourage you to involve students in this process, having them give input on what respect looks like to them and active listening and those is and isn't. And we do have a few resources that you could use to support you with that. We have on the left-hand side an example of a norms poster. So, of course, you can develop your own. We had a teacher in our network develop this norms poster on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, sentence starters and frames. And we have those as free resources for you to use either to support your students in making their own or as tools as is. Something to point out as far as the sentence starter piece on the right-hand side is the disagreeing and challenging and agreeing and supporting are really important categories, but we also have the categories of connecting and building and encouraging and including to try to help students think, hey, when I'm entering a conversation, I don't have to always enter with an agree or disagree viewpoint. I can build on one another's thoughts, ask questions, dive in more before I assert a viewpoint. And one other resource we have as far as setting up a framework for civil discourse with your students is what we'll call AWARE. It's outlined in that primer document I shared about, but we also have kind of a go-to guide if you would like something like this for students. It's student facing, saying, how do we navigate these difficult conversations with confidence? And some, again, self-explanatory as far as things like respect, but some I know our team really enjoys leaning into. Like one of them is W for wonder. And that's really that sense of curiosity. Tell me more about your viewpoint, what led to that viewpoint in this conversation. And then some great overlap here as far as what civil discourse is and isn't and the goals of it. So one thing I know that we are able to, it seems like I can see the chat going. So would love to hear your thoughts on this now or as time continues, but just as kind of a checkpoint as we get into a lot of different strategies and resources that you can use. Would love to hear from your viewpoint across the US, as the chat showed, you all are coming from all over, is how is civil discourse a productive struggle in your role or in your classroom or maybe supporting educators at your school? And why, in your context, do you see this work as critical? So you already took the first step by joining this call, and we're curious to read your context on how this is having an impact. And feel free, like we'll have a pause here, but if you're typing something up, do still share it if we're moving on. And thank you. So we can see and getting started, like there's so much learning and growth in the struggle, and it's very productive for students not only to engage in the struggle as well, but for them to see adults navigating the struggle appropriately. Yeah. All right. Well, please do continue to share if you're able, especially things that connect to your school particularly. I will keep going for now with some different strategies so that we'll zoom through.
Yep. Yeah, please keep them coming. These are really helpful. It's good for us to get your perspectives as well, because it also can guide our the way we present and taking this to different levels around the country. So it's really, really great to have your input. I just want to walk through a lighter session initially on tools for getting started. I realize, of course, it's February and you've gotten started a long time ago, but sometimes it's good to revisit these. So we've got some simple tips and tricks that you've probably already tried, but thinking about maybe a different angle on things. So let's dive in. One of the things that we always suggest, particularly when we're doing back to school professional development, is just breaking down barriers and getting students to be willing to talk and establish points of view. So starting with those disarming topics like, what's the best candy out there? What should we wear to school? Would you rather games and things like that. So we've got some suggestions on that. And many of you that are working in spaces where you're in a classroom, getting them up and moving with corners activities, gallery walks, and things like that, while often create a little bit of extra work for us, are well worth the results that we can gain from them, getting students up, moving, and talking with their peers on various issues. But the last part is thinking about your own activities. Do you often provide more than two choices? So obviously, a this or that or a would you rather is great, but think about an additional choice or two to get the students outside those limited, non-nuanced points of view on an issue. So, and finally, you'll notice on the bottom of the screen, and this is really, really important, whether it's something as silly as your what's the best candy, or perhaps something a little bit deeper when it comes to free speech or immigration or some of the topics that we can are so contentious today, is that requiring not only articulation but substantiation. That you're it's great, you're allowed to develop a point of view, but why did you get there? What's leading to that? That comes back to that wonder. We need to prompt our students to say, I wonder why you're thinking that way. So we've got dozens of these, but we won't bore you with all of those. But some simple would you rather things, like we said, like, okay, so kids will talk about what they eat, but it'll get them talking. So thinking about how you might start your school year next year with different ideas for games and activities to get them talking. And maybe you throw a wrench at them. Like I said, it's easy to just choose from one to the other, but what if you throw this in the mix? This might make students change their mind and move to a different corner of the room, asking them their involvement with their peers. Would you rather work in a group or would you rather be by yourself? Why is that? Why do you feel that way? I love this one. For those of you that have students that have jobs and leave the building as quickly as they can to go out and make money, is I could give you $20 a day for a year. Would you like that, or would you rather wait and get it all at once? Imagine the conversations that will get these students thinking about personal financial decisions or how they might need the money and what they would use it for immediately. We've done this a couple of times. We don't do student events as a rule, but early on in the organization, we did a few. And it was interesting to see the students who worked took over these conversations because they had to explain, no, I have to help my parents put food on the table, or I'm trying to save for college, whatever it might be. But then maybe try something different. We like this one a lot because it's also, for those of you that are in the social studies world, but living in this society, is there's so many constitutional questions. So who should get to decide? This gets students thinking about their own decision making, but also authority figures and how they play a role in our lives. So we might say, we're going to put four corners together. And those of you that have to work in a virtual space, I know there are all kinds of fancy apps that you can use to make this happen as well. There are Padlets, and I think Sarah, you mentioned there's a Figma. There's a number of tools that you can do this with, and I'm sure you're excellent at them. I know during COVID, Pear Deck was a lifesaver. But maybe you put four choices, and you're going to ask them a series of questions. So one is, who should decide what I get to wear to school or what I wear every day? Who should have that authority and why? And if you're in a physical space, move them to a corner, let them choose, let them talk, explain why they're there, and then share that out. And if someone changes their mind, which in this case they may not, give them the opportunity to do so. Or who should decide when you're responsible enough to drive and get your license? And the role that you can play in all of this is not only choose your corner, articulate why you're there, but then as the facilitator, you might throw a wrench or two at them. Okay, all of you that said you should have that authority, are you prepared for the responsibility if you screw up? If Are you prepared to pay for your insurance? How are you going to do that? So always constantly throwing points at them to say, you should probably think more about your substantiation and how that could change based on your situation. What about AI? This is a great ongoing topic. It's changing so fast. Who should decide if I can use AI? And if in your area you have a policy, it's worth discussing why the policy exists. Students probably have questions, and inevitably they may try to use it anyway, even if they're not permitted. And kids love talking about school-related events. Uh, if you're in a physical space, everybody likes to talk about the lunch cafeteria food, how much homework they have. If you're working in a space where students get breaks during the day or recess, what we should be doing during those breaks, etc. So those are just some lighthearted topics, but we've got some other angles to share with you now.
Yeah, and one of our toolkits that we have, I think that I might have missed this in saying that all of our resources are freely accessible on our website, and you don't have to have an account to download or access them. And one of the resources we have is called our Civil Discourse Middle School Toolkit. And we put middle in quotation marks because we joke that it really should just be called the Civil Discourse Toolkit because all of the resource in there really can be scaled up or down, and strategies in there apply for all of secondary or even can be adapted for upper elementary. And this collection has a ton of different self-assessment tools, lesson plans, activities, slideshows that you can download and edit and use in a virtual or in-person space. And one of them, for example, is this worry-free middle school like discussion starters with questions that some are silly, like is a hot dog a sandwich here? And on the right-hand side, you'll see the teacher that created these because all of our resources are teacher made and we help produce them. These were the directions that worked well for her class, but the good thing is you can download and edit these and make it fit for your space as well. And then they progress up through some other ones, like a little more pressing things, like how does social media affect our lives? And then once your students have got this down, you can kind of create questions that fit your local region or current events and kind of build their way up to these discussions. One of my other personal favorite activities that's a part of the toolkit is called Test the Waters, and it's a way to see what background knowledge, emotions your students are coming in with about a particular topic. I've heard of math teachers even using this to get students discussing and asserting viewpoints like, hey, students, when you think about geometry, which of these represents the way you feel and why? And again, it's that viewpoint, but it's also to help you as a teacher to mentally prep yourself and, as we say, test the waters to see where students are on these topics. And here's an example of this used I believe it was with a novel study with the theme of justice. And so you can see how students can kind of take it up with, and some examples here of student responses of making those kind of metaphor connections between images and a topic and sharing their viewpoint on it. So hopefully this can help you get a feel for where students are at. And as far as a lot of different strategies, there is a resource called 11 Civil Discourse Strategies to Try in Your Classroom, that it's a long article with directions on how to do actually all of these 11 different strategies. And so we won't be going through all of them because that would take a while. I will be sharing a couple, but would love to just pause for a moment to give you a chance to see the set of 11 before sharing a couple examples. And if there's any of these that you have done or tried yourself in your classroom, would love if you would share that in the chat, or any favorite strategies that you've used that aren't included here, as I know that this isn't all of them in the world. And with that, I will go ahead and just share a couple of the examples of them. Uh, One, for example, is called the opinion lineup, and I shared here on the screen. This is an example of one of the Figma boards if you're wanting to do a digital version, but you can also do a physical room version with like a piece of painter's tape on the floor, or one wall say strongly agree, one wall say strongly disagree. And students place themselves physically on a Likert scale or digital sticky note style on if they agree or disagree with a statement. And the key is allowing students to discuss why they're placing themselves there, with the opportunity to move, maybe once they've heard more viewpoints. One way to elevate this is having a sticky note or an index card for them to have research done before placing themselves, if it is content that relates to finding out information before asserting a viewpoint. The statements there at the bottom are just examples of general statements that you can use to better understand your classroom. And then the next one is a fishbowl strategy, which in an in-person or virtual space could work, because if it's a live virtual session, basically the concept is one smaller group of students is having a conversation and the other students are observing. If in a physical space, it's that outside ring watching like an inner smaller circle. And we do have different self-assessment and also peer assessment tools that you can download and edit for students to be monitoring for certain norms. Let's say that the outside ring is focusing in on evidence being used in the discussion. Those are some examples of ways you can do that, but also you can have an outside ring buddy being a support for the inside ring as well. So a way to help students focus in on a discussion and look for those look fors, listen fors in discourse. I'll have John share a few more pieces here. And John, you're muted. Has to happen at least once.
Of course I am. Marwan, keep the conversation going as you have thoughts and ideas in the chat or want to share your experiences. We really encourage that. So let's talk a little bit about meanings of the conversation. We often like to call this what happens when things go wrong or awry? What should I have in my toolkit? What should I know about myself and my students? So a couple of thoughts on that. Maybe we start with the question is, why does it matter that people think differently than I do? Why should I be concerned about that? And as a guide towards understanding viewpoint diversity, and as you can see on the screen, really pushing the emphasis on respecting that these people that I'm around have points of view and opinions and have arrived at them on their own. I should respect them as fellow human beings and give them the dignity they deserve and hear what they have to say. And if we disagree, that's okay. We can still have lunch together. We can still go to recess together. We can do whatever. It's just, it doesn't have to be such a divisive point in our lives that because we don't agree, we can't work together, talk together, go to school together. A couple of thoughts on other ways that you might spark conversations. Always looking for ways to get students to start talking. One is with picture perspectives. So, as a former social studies teacher and spending a great deal of time on the United States post-Civil War era, the Industrial Revolution, as well as the progressive era when all the reforms happened due to child labor, excessive labor hours, and dangerous working conditions, getting students to look at an image and say, hmm, what surprises you? What interests you? What troubles you about what you're seeing? Or, like concerns suggest in the ever popular claim, evidence, and reasoning. Above the lower graphic, you'll see a chart. One of the lessons in our criminal justice unit is mass incarceration, and it's centered on students developing a project around one or two of the demographics in the chart, where they have to really present and explain, why might this be happening? Why might students in juvenile detention, why might they be there? What's driving that? What should we know about the areas and the communities that they live in, socioeconomics, all kinds of ideas on that. But these things can spark discussion. Another one might be looking at if you're teaching economics, or you're teaching anything with the Constitution, civics, and government, about government spending. I mean, it's in and around us continuously. I'm sure we're all aware that the State of the Union address is this evening, and there are a number of related events that will be going on during it on social media channels. And one of the things that will be discussed are these types of things: government spending on things that we all, our parents use, our grandparents have used over the years, like Social Security and Medicare. We're always hearing conversations about these things, and then comparing that to defense spending. Student loan conversations are always pretty juicy, obviously. Uh, or we grab something like a recent study being done. The Washington Post, when the United States sent the military to Venezuela, sent out a poll, and we can have students talk about this, look at this, and say, what claim would you make based on what you see here? What's the evidence behind it? Or you might do what do you like about this? What concerns you? What would you suggest? Or SIT, right? Surprise, interest, troubles you, or whatever strategy you have that works. And we have a link in this to a poll, but I won't go into that right now. If you want to see the poll, this is one of my favorites, only because it was a solution that was provided to me by a speech and debate teacher. For those of you who get frustrated because students disengage or are shy and don't necessarily want to get involved in the conversation, a way to encourage that is get a bag of pennies. Hopefully they won't be throwing them at each other, but they'll be on the desk, and they simply have to spend their money. I recommend starting with 2, 3, or 4, or 5 pennies. And if you're doing a fishbowl conversation or small group discussion, every student has to spend that money, and each penny is a contribution that they make, whether it be a challenge question, providing evidence, asserting a point of view in the conversation, or just discussion. And once everyone has spent their money, what I loved about it was then it was an opportunity for more free and open conversation between students. This was really interesting because it gave those students who are shy, bashful, and are afraid to engage, placed a minimum requirement. But then the students who often do like to talk and dominate the conversation have to wait their turn until all the money is spent, and then they can contribute more. So managing the discussion, we have so much more on this than this one slide, but a couple of things to think about. One is know yourself and how you will handle situations that may come up. But then secondly, what should you expect? What are the hypotheticals that may happen in your classroom discussions? Students are so unpredictable. That's what makes them so much fun to be around, in my opinion. But it also can make things a little bit scary sometimes when they assert concerning points of view or statements. So thinking about, what do I do when things get tense and the temperatures are rising? When do I step in? When do I step back and say they can figure this out? What do I do as an educator if someone says something offensive or hurtful, right? Obviously, we are the adults in the room, and we're not here to give you legal advice, but you know what that might require, that you have to step in at that point and realize that the student can't participate if they continue with this behavior. And of course, if it's really, really reprehensible, then obviously school policy would kick in. Thinking about misinformation. How can you as a facilitator challenge that in a way that is disarming, to say, it seems like the rest of the class doesn't quite understand where you're coming from in that. Where did you get that information? We'd like to learn more. So always with that eye towards curiosity. Disengagement, conversation dies. How can I pull them back in? Maybe the conversation is dead and we should move towards journaling and writing a point of view and a perspective and coming back the next day to talk more. So, so again, relying on our norms, always being able to go back to them, knowing what we control, knowing ourselves, and then what are the pivots? What are the tools that I can grab when things get a little bit tense?
John, we
Go
did
ahead,
have
sir.
a question come in the chat that I thought might build into the slide that you just shared from
Okay.
Steve. And for the rest of the group in the recording, it says, since students are developing polarized views at an early age, how does one structure any of these exercises that require openness in such a way where the loudest radicalized options won't derail or chill expression of other views? And how do you get students to feel comfortable sorting themselves like into opinion groups publicly when others might be judging them on that?
Yeah, those are great questions for sure. And we're here to say we don't have all the right answers, but definitely starting back when you have the opportunity to start small. Start with small conversations that aren't necessarily over polarized issues to get them comfortable doing that. The other part of that I think lends to what I mentioned earlier is knowing your students and knowing how they might be connected to your topic. So there may be those instances where if you pulled up the lesson on mass incarceration, for example, that could be a sticky situation if you have students who have relatives who are currently incarcerated, or and in the same time you may have students whose parents are in law enforcement, criminal justice, they're lawyers, even a judge. So I think that's a really good question, and there is no one right answer on that. But also, you do control the environment. So laying down the ground rules and going back to the norms to say these things are not acceptable when we engage with one another. We don't try to be the loudest voice. We allow our peers to speak, and that's how the conversation has to go. But I feel your concern here. I keep rereading the question, and how do we get them to not derail or chill the expression of other views? We've seen this happen with adults at some of our events when teachers get attached to a particular point of view when we have a scholar presenting on stage. So we have to be the facilitators that say these are the behaviors we expect. When we can't do that, then we can't have these types of conversations and activities. I think that's a pretty basic response, but in the moment, um, probably adequate for the time that we have. Uh, if you have more questions, though, we'll provide our emails as well too.
Yeah, and as we continue, one activity that comes to mind, and I'll kind of connect it here a little bit, that we don't have a slide for, but one quick activity that kind of helps students try on other viewpoints can be something as simple as having Skittle packets if you're in person, where each color represents a different viewpoint. And to give an example of this, like what's your favorite season? Red Skittles represent fall, yellow Skittles represent winter. If you have one red Skittle, share one reason why someone might think that winter is the best season. And you can do that all the way up through something like what's the top policy issue facing our country right now. Anything that's getting students to also just try to step into or try on other viewpoints and share the why might someone have this viewpoint can also help. And not necessarily assigning one viewpoint to a student, maybe exploring two to three to four of them, kind of like John shared, escaping the binary. So that's a quick activity that I like. As far as another challenge that's often faced, something like misinformation or biased information coming up, these are just some examples of ways that you can have a go-to response for when students might be using information that's questionable. But I also just encourage you to have something that you use all the time. So even when the student that's sharing information that's spot on, that you respond in the same way. So that way, students we know that you're not targeting students, but that way students can vouch for you and say, hey, Mrs. Lane always says, hey, where did you get your information on that? Or she always says, tell me more. So that way you have that same kind of go-to response to address both great and not so great responses from students. We aren't a media literacy organization.
Sarah, if I can
Oh,
throw
yeah.
one thing in. Sorry, Steve Pointer, I wanted to be cognizant of the other part of that question, where how do you get students to feel comfortable sorting themselves? One of the things that is the beauty of you managing the conversation is perhaps you control the sorting initially so that they're in heterogeneous groupings and that you don't see groups who are forming a silo. That's one thing. And then I think the other part is where you said, especially when they know their classmates are already prepared to judge them. I would go back to the our aware poster, because the first one is that when we assert, the expectation is, and if you can't do this, then you're not going to be able to function in the conversation. That's is the response to our students, that we assert with humility and intellectual credibility. I think that's a really key point that we have to really push into our students. And it takes a lot of time, right? You can't just come in and do these hard conversations on the first day of class or even the third week of class in many cases. It takes time.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Sarah.
John. Yeah. And just a quick shout out that we aren't a media literacy organization, but there are a lot of great organizations. If you're saying, hey, well, how do I make sure students are pulling from different sources or pulling from sources that are valid as far as the misinformation piece? All Sides Media has great media bias charts that usually people have seen, but sometimes they haven't explored how they also provide headlines that show like a left, center, right perspective headline for students to explore. And then there's some other groups here that support things like navigating, determining what is AI, some pieces on fact checking. So make sure to check some of those out if those are pieces that you're looking for, particularly for current events. And we won't spend much time on this, just a couple quick points because sometimes it comes up like, hey, well, how do I assess if students are making progress in this? How do I get them reflecting? So, as far as reflection pieces, we do have a lot of free resources on our website, experience rubrics, self-assessments, but encourage them to participate in reflective practices when things go right or when things go awry. So that way, those reflective practices are just become innate so that when things might go wrong, students are prepared to engage in that practice. There's a few example questions there, just simple, like three things. Like if you can get students into a routine of reflecting on how a conversation changed them, how they had an impact on others, and what they would change the next time, that can be kind of an easy routine for students to get into analyzing it from those three viewpoints. But I encourage you to explore kind of our reflective pieces if you're interested in that. And as far as assessments, I love connecting civil discourse back to all of the different standard areas as speaking and listening skills, trying on diverse viewpoints, even in math, logic and reasoning and understanding arguments are all embedded. So I encourage you to dig into that. If you are looking for self-evaluation tools, we do have examples where you could download these, edit the lines, add your class norms. And some tips can be if you have an interactive notebook, either a physical one or like a OneNote type notebook, you could have students kind of self-assess categories as time goes on, um, and do assessment practices that work for you. Uh, Very quickly, as I know we're nearing the end of the time together, if you have questions, please start kind of dropping those in the chat now, that we can help address. And we'll just share a few resources that we have available for you. As far as when you go on our website, we've mentioned it a lot. There's three categories. We have classroom content collection, professional development, and Sphere Summit. And for classroom content, if you are looking for something specific, do feel free to email us, but we have collections across all different subject areas. And then right now, we're especially featuring our 250th collection that includes ELA and social studies resources for across 5th through 12th grade. So those are great collections as well. And we do have an upcoming webinar too. If you do teach 250th or want to dig in more, it's going to be a neat one on women in the American Revolution and their roles in that. And so fostering civil discourse on character traits related to that. And that's also linked on our PD page as well.
Yep. And we offer free professional development on the road. We take these types of events and build out longer and deeper ones. We partner with you as a school or as a district to bring programming that's meaningful for you and your faculty and your colleagues. So if you're interested in that, you can find Sphere on the Road down on the bottom of our webpage, and you might see links throughout it as well. We don't have time to get into all the formatting of that, but if you're interested in more, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to share more. And finally, we have a 5-day, 4-night event in Washington, D.C. every summer. It's called Sphere Summit. It's a scholarship-based event. You do have to apply. We vet and review every application and to either accept, decline, or wait list. So there are some parameters that have to be met. Briefly, I will let you know that we're almost full already for the coming summer, but don't let that discourage you from putting your name in the ring because we still have reviews to do. You get there, we provide a $500 stipend, and you get your own hotel room at a Marriott in downtown DC, and the food is out of this world. And it's a deep dive into civil discourse with academics and scholars across the ideological spectrum on all of the different issues that are challenging us in not only school, but in society as well. All right.
Right. And we
Thank you
do have,
both very much. Yeah, Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to start with Ralph's question there, maybe as a quick segue. I know we only have about 4 or 5 minutes technically, but Ralph asked if civil discourse is supposed to be based on facts and evidence. How do you make room for students expressing emotions on the issues at hand?
That is a really great question. It's not the first time we've seen that question. I'll respond briefly, and then Sarah, if you want to add anything to that. Um, a lot of teachers that we talked to and did myself in the classroom was having the moment of just understanding what do I think about this issue and what's gotten me there. So they're still having to substantiate their point of view, even if we may not be diving into research articles and data or the latest news sources or their social media. So I think there is a place for that for discovery. That's my brief answer. Sarah, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that as well.
yeah, I think there's some great activities that you can use to build in that recognition of emotions too, because I think that's really important to make it known that it's a personal thing. We have emotions attached to our viewpoints. I love bringing in art and poetry as well. And we have some neat rhetorical thinking and listening lessons if you look on our rhetoric collection. But one of them is called Terministic Screens, and it's thinking about how each of us are looking at things with a different lens. So a quick activity that you can use if you're wanting to kind of connect to that can be taking a photo with different color effects labeled on it. Like, so one picture looks different with all these different tints on it, and having a discussion about how we're approaching this issue with these lived experiences and backgrounds, feelings, and beliefs. We all are talking about the same issue, but we all are looking at it through those experiences and emotions. And that can be a entry point for maybe students talking about that. And we also have some poetry pieces as well. Learning more about the AWARE framework and using poetry and art forms, I think, can be a way to ground it in content, but also recognizing those emotions behind it.
You offered a lot of great entry points, but just where would you suggest if people were saying, this is all, there's a lot here. I'm super interested. I want to sort of, act. I want to mobilize sort of myself here. What would a starting point be tomorrow? What would you suggest to folks?
My first suggestion would be developing the space for these kinds of conversations. So, really focusing on building classroom norms and expectations. And this is, to me, in many cases, somewhat separate from school policy and school rules. This is more of the guideline of in our class, we're going to have conversations. They may be light and fun, they may be challenging and difficult, but here are the ground rules, and then building those practices in, not just in some of the areas that we've shared here, but even within your content. Also, I think a second piece is everything doesn't have to be about something that they may be attached to today. So, like Sarah said, art and literature, these are great ways for students to get involved in what I would call disarming conversations where they're allowed to attach a perspective to things. And it may be a 10-minute conversation. You may just do, we've got some teachers in our network that on the platform X do. On Tuesdays, we vote. So they have an issue that they put up, their students vote, and they share the pie chart on the X platform about that issue and how their students voted. Of course, it's anonymous. What about if it's on Fridays we talk? And that every Friday we design maybe a 10 or a 15-minute conversation, because we know you have a lot of content to get through as well. So realizing you can't do 50 minutes of civil discourse every day or even every single once or twice a week. So that's a suggestion, is starting small, but building that space.
We are at the top of the hour here, so I want to sort of honor everyone's time and just thank everyone for joining us this evening, this afternoon, depending on your time zone. This was a wonderful entry point into a very, very important topic and sort of reality that we really need to explore further. So I want to thank Sarah and John from Sphere for joining us. And not sure, Mr. Hausman, if you wanted to end off with any last comment before we close up.
No, I think Sarah and John did a great job, and I just really appreciate them being here. I was wondering if there was somebody who wanted to stick around just for a couple of seconds, would you mind taking another question or two if there is any?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
You're free to leave. We're going to stop the recording, but if anybody does want to stick around, I really appreciate you just spending a couple of extra minutes if there's somebody else. So thank you all for being here.
Yep. And if you want to, we do a monthly newsletter and we send out emails to alert educators to upcoming webinar and events such as that. We don't flood your inbox. So if you're interested, there's a QR code on screen.